Ladies and gentlemen, students, thinkers, people on the edge of becoming, let me begin by saying something you might not expect. I was wrong about failure. For many years I believed, like so many others, that failure was something to be avoided, that it was a stain on your record, a mark of incompetence, a reason for shame. Make prompt of above text to create images. But that belief was incorrect. Not only incorrect, but damaging. You see, when you regard failure as a personal flaw rather than a natural consequence of striving, you paralyze yourself. You become afraid to speak, afraid to try, afraid to confront the unknown. And there's a price for that fear. The price is your potential. We have to begin by rejecting a very common but deeply flawed assumption, that failure is the same thing as incompetence, that if you fail, if you fall short of your goal, if your efforts collapse under pressure, if you take a risk and it doesn't pan out, that this somehow proves that you're not capable, or worse, not worthy. And that's simply not true. In fact, the presence of failure, the very fact that failure is possible in your life, is evidence of something profoundly meaningful. You are engaged in something challenging enough to matter. You are not on the sidelines. You're participating in life, and in a game that's hard enough that the outcome is uncertain. That is not incompetence. That is courage. Consider this. The only people who never fail are people who don't try anything new. People who are hiding. People who have arranged their lives in such a way that there's no real challenge, no tension, no possibility of meaningful loss. But the flip side is that there's also no possibility of meaningful success. These individuals mistake comfort for competence. They protect themselves from failure by narrowing their world, but in doing so, they also eliminate the possibility of growth. Because to grow, psychologically, emotionally, spiritually, professionally, is to voluntarily walk into domains where you are likely to stumble. The very act of failing proves that you were courageous enough to stretch beyond your current capacity. When you fail at something, a job interview, a relationship, an exam, a business, you are receiving feedback from the structure of the world. That feedback is painful, yes, but it is also informative. It says, here is where your current abilities fall short of the demands of the task. That's not a condemnation, that's a diagnosis, and it's a gift, because it gives you a place to start. Failure gives form to your ignorance. It draws the outline around what you do not yet understand or cannot yet do. That's not something to be ashamed of, it's something to be attentive to. It means your engagement with reality is deepening. You are becoming more aware of where you stand in relation to your goals. One of the fundamental tenets of learning theory, even in the domain of cognitive behavioral psychology, is that progress comes from incremental confrontation with error. In simple terms, you try, you fail, you correct, you try again. That process, repeated over time, refines not just your skills, but your character. So when we define failure as evidence of incompetence, we arrest that process. We shame the very thing that allows a person to transform, and that shame becomes internalized. People begin to associate the experience of failure with their identity. I failed becomes I am a failure. And once that happens, we no longer see failure as a part of the journey. We see it as the end. But here's the truth. If you're willing to face it, you cannot become competent at anything meaningful without failing at it first. You cannot become strong without first being weak. You cannot become wise without first being wrong. And you cannot become resilient without first encountering hardship. So when you fail, remember this. The failure itself is not a verdict on your potential. It is a reflection of your courage to participate in something demanding. It means you are in the game. And that's where life is lived. Not in the safety of knowing, but in the risk of learning. So if you've failed recently, that doesn't mean you're incompetent. It means you're engaged. And that engagement, messy, painful, unpredictable, though it may be, is the first step toward something far greater than competence: mastery. Our fear of failure doesn't simply arise from laziness or weakness. Though those are convenient labels we often use to explain why people avoid trying. No, the fear runs deeper than that. It's existential. It's tied to a misunderstanding of what responsibility truly entails and the weight we believe it places upon us when we engage with life. You see, people often conflate responsibility with fault. They think, if I take responsibility for this, then I am also to blame if it goes wrong. And that logic, while seemingly rational, is profoundly limiting. The truth is, when you accept responsibility, you're not signing a contract that guarantees success. You're stepping into a position of voluntary burden, knowing full well that the outcome is uncertain. That's what makes it noble. But many people don't see it that way. They believe that responsibility means carrying the crushing expectation of getting everything right. And that belief makes every misstep, every setback, feel like a moral failing, not just an error in judgment, but an indictment of their entire character. That's paralyzing. No wonder people are afraid to take risks, to try new things, to speak up, to pursue a dream. They don't just fear the failure itself, they fear what the failure will say about them. This fear is magnified by the culture we live in. In many modern environments, academic, corporate, even social, mistakes are penalized swiftly and sometimes publicly. There's a performance aspect to everything now. Social media has turned daily life into a highlight reel where success is broadcast and failure is hidden or ridiculed. So people become obsessed with presenting perfection, and they learn, often unconsciously, that it's safer to avoid responsibility than to risk failing publicly under the weight of it. But that approach creates a much bigger problem. It fosters helplessness. When you avoid responsibility in an attempt to avoid failure, you also forfeit your ability to improve. Because responsibility, properly understood, is not about guaranteeing success. It's about orienting yourself toward meaningful goals and accepting the cost of that pursuit. When we reframe responsibility as the courage to confront the unknown, rather than as a demand for perfection, the fear of failure begins to dissolve. Responsibility is not about always getting it right. It's about showing up with integrity, learning from your mistakes, and staying in the game even when you fall short. In fact, one of the most psychologically healthy things a person can do is to accept responsibility without self-condemnation. That is to say, I will try, I will lead, I will risk, and if I fail, I will take ownership of the outcome, not because I am guilty, but because I am committed. That mindset transforms fear into fuel. It turns failure into feedback. It allows you to fail without falling apart. And that resilience is what builds real confidence over time. Too many people wait for certainty before they act. They want to be sure they won't fail before they take responsibility. But life doesn't work that way. You become strong by stepping into responsibility, not after you've proven you're worthy of it. If you wait until you're ready, you'll never move. And if you refuse to move, you'll never grow. Responsibility, when properly understood, isn't a trap. It's a path toward meaning, toward growth, toward becoming someone capable of withstanding the chaos of life with courage. And so, if you find yourself afraid of failure, look deeper. You're not just afraid of getting something wrong. You're afraid of what it means to take ownership of your life. But the moment you realize that responsibility is not a punishment, but a privilege, that it is not about blame, but about becoming, then failure loses its power to define you. And that's when you truly begin to live. From the very beginning of formal education, we are taught, often unconsciously, that the worst thing we can do is to be wrong. That the goal of learning is to get the right answer, to pass the test, to avoid mistakes. But what this system produces is not genuine intelligence or creativity. What it produces, most effectively, is obedience. It teaches us to play it safe, to stick to the known, and to steer clear of anything that might reveal ignorance or inadequacy. And in doing so, it instills in us a deep, lifelong aversion to risk, precisely the thing that genuine growth depends on. Consider how children enter school. They begin curious, impulsive, full of questions, always trying things, touching things, and asking why. But slowly, as they pass through years of standardized testing, rigid grading rubrics, and increasingly bureaucratic expectations, they learn that curiosity is only rewarded when it fits neatly into the correct answer box. There is little room for process, for wandering, for wrong turns. Instead, there is a sharp focus on outcomes, usually binary ones. You either get it right or you don't. You either pass or fail. And with every red mark on the page, the message becomes louder. Don't be wrong, but this is a disaster for actual learning. Because real learning is inherently iterative. It requires trial and error. It requires missteps, confusion, recalibration. If you're learning something meaningful, something complex, you will get it wrong before you get it right. That's not a flaw in the process. That is the process. So when students are conditioned to avoid error, they are also being conditioned to avoid learning. They memorize, they recite, they cram, but they don't engage, they don't experiment. And without experimentation, there is no originality, no innovation, no personal transformation. The system rewards correctness over discovery. It rewards compliance over inquiry. And the consequence of that is a population that has been trained to fear the unknown. Because in the system, the unknown is where you make mistakes, and mistakes are punished. But life is nothing but unknowns. The real world, the one outside the classroom, is not multiple choice. It's full of uncertainty, chaos, nuance. And to navigate that world successfully, you must be able to act without knowing the outcome in advance. You must be able to risk being wrong. But when the education system punishes error, it doesn't just stunt intellectual development. It also damages character. It breeds perfectionism. It fosters anxiety. It creates people who are so afraid of making a mistake that they never speak up, never try something new, never stretch themselves into discomfort. They stick to what they know. They become fragile, psychologically and emotionally, because they have never been taught how to fail well. They've only been taught how to avoid failure. And that's not resilience. That's fear in disguise. Ironically, the greatest thinkers, inventors, and leaders in history, the very people the educational system claims to celebrate, were those who failed repeatedly, often spectacularly. They made errors, revised their models, endured criticism, and tried again. They did not fear error. They pursued it because they understood that it was the pathway to truth. But our system does not reflect that understanding. It reflects an industrial model of conformity, not a human model of exploration. So if you feel afraid of making mistakes, if you hesitate to take risks, if you instinctively avoid anything where failure is possible, it may not be because you're weak. It may be because you've been conditioned. Conditioned to believe that mistakes make you unworthy. Conditioned to believe that error is a reflection of identity, not simply a step on the road to mastery. And that conditioning must be unlearned if you are to become anything more than a product of the system. The solution is to re-educate yourself, not just in facts, but in mindset. To understand that growth is not linear and success is not sterile, that true education is not about getting everything right. It's about engaging with the world deeply enough that you are willing to get it wrong and brave enough to try again. Perfectionism is often mistaken for a virtue. It's praised as the pursuit of excellence, as a sign of high standards and ambition. But this is a profound misinterpretation. Perfectionism, at its core, is not about doing things with care or striving for mastery. It is about avoiding shame. It is a defense mechanism, a psychological strategy aimed not at genuine achievement, but at protecting the self from the terror of being exposed as inadequate. And this misunderstanding causes a great deal of suffering because perfectionism doesn't lead to success. It leads to paralysis, burnout, and chronic dissatisfaction. You must understand, there is a vast difference between the desire to grow and the compulsion to be flawless. The person striving for mastery is willing to fail. They see error as a natural part of development. They can endure the discomfort of incompletion and even humiliation because their aim is rooted in reality. They want to become better, not appear perfect. But the perfectionist is not aiming at growth. They are aiming at control, at image, at a fragile ideal they believe will finally make them feel safe, accepted, or worthy. And that's the key point. Perfectionism is a mask. It disguises deep insecurity, a belief that unless I perform without error, I will be rejected. I will be humiliated. I will be exposed. The perfectionist is not motivated by the joy of doing something well. They are haunted by the fear of being seen as someone who isn't enough. That fear runs so deep it compels them to delay, to overwork, to obsess, or to never begin at all. Because when the standard is perfection, there is no acceptable margin for mistake. And when you define yourself by your performance, any flaw becomes a threat to your entire identity. This mindset is often instilled early in life, sometimes by environments that reward performance more than effort, where love or attention seems conditional on success, and failure is met not with guidance, but with disappointment or withdrawal. Over time, the child doesn't simply learn to try hard. They learn that who they are is only valuable when they succeed. That belief calcifies into adulthood, and perfectionism becomes the only strategy to avoid feeling like a fraud. But here's the tragic irony. Perfectionism doesn't protect you from pain, it causes it. It convinces you that nothing you do is ever good enough, that rest is laziness, and that vulnerability is weakness. You can never celebrate progress because the standard always moves. You can't connect deeply with others because perfection demands that you hide your flaws. You live in a state of constant self-surveillance, anxious, hypercritical, and exhausted, all in the name of an impossible ideal. Excellence, on the other hand, is different. Excellence is grounded. It comes from self-respect, not self-rejection. The excellent person is disciplined, yes, but they are also patient. They understand that learning takes time and failure is part of the process. They do not expect to get everything right, but they aim to improve steadily. They are open to feedback, not because they fear judgment, but because they value truth. And most importantly, they do not tie their worth to their results. They know who they are, and they trust themselves enough to be imperfect on the way to something better. If you find yourself constantly caught in loops of self-doubt, perfectionism, and procrastination, understand this. It is not because you are broken. It is because you are trying to protect something tender in yourself, your self-worth, by controlling everything around you. But that strategy doesn't work. The more you cling to perfection, the more fragile you become. And the only way out is to let go of the mask and allow yourself to be seen, flawed, human, growing. Only then can you trade the impossible standard of perfection for the noble pursuit of becoming excellent. Not perfect, but real, resilient, and free. Failure has a peculiar quality that makes it unlike any other human experience. It strips away illusion. It tears the mask off our pretensions and brings us face to face with something most of us spend a great deal of energy avoiding: the truth. Not just the truth about the task we were trying to complete, but the truth about ourselves, our limitations, our assumptions, our blind spots, our fears. And though this confrontation is uncomfortable, even painful, it is also deeply necessary, because without that truth, there can be no real growth, no genuine understanding, and no authentic strength. That is why failure, far from being merely a misstep, can be considered sacred. We live in a world saturated with image, social media, professional environments, and even educational institutions encourage us, sometimes subtly, sometimes overtly, to curate how we appear. We learn to project competence, confidence, polish. We learn to perform, but failure disrupts the performance. It doesn't care how carefully you've constructed your persona. When you fail, the reality of your situation reveals itself, unfiltered, uncontrollable, and often humbling. That can feel like collapse, but in truth, it is revelation. You see what's actually there. And that is an extraordinary gift if you have the courage to look. The sacredness of failure lies in its capacity to break through denial. People are often trapped in patterns of behavior or thought that are not working, professionally, relationally, emotionally. But as long as things appear to be functioning, they don't question those patterns. They keep doing what they've always done because it's familiar, and familiarity provides a false sense of control. Then failure strikes, and suddenly the illusion crumbles. That job isn't secure. That relationship wasn't as strong as you thought. That belief about yourself or the world wasn't accurate. And as painful as that realization is, it also marks the beginning of transformation, because now you are dealing with reality. But not everyone sees it that way. Many people respond to failure by retreating further into delusion. They blame others, they rationalize, they numb themselves with distractions. Why? Because truth is demanding. When you are shown the limits of your competence, when you are exposed to your own ignorance, when you see how your actions, or inactions, contributed to your downfall, it's tempting to flee. But to do so is to miss the very point of the experience. You are being given insight. You are being handed a mirror that reflects what is actually happening beneath the surface of your life, and it is in that moment, when you choose to stay present with the failure, to examine it, to let it inform you, that the process becomes sacred. Because now you are not just enduring failure, you are learning from it. You are being reshaped by truth. And truth, though it may cut, is what ultimately sets you free. Free from self-deception, free from arrogance, free from the tyranny of perfectionism. It clears the ground so that something new, something more stable and honest, can be built in its place. It's also important to understand that failure doesn't just expose individual truths. It often exposes structural truths about systems, institutions, or even cultural assumptions. Many of the greatest advancements in human history have come not from success, but from failure. Failures that revealed a flaw in conventional wisdom or a gap in our understanding. Whether in science, art, or moral philosophy, it is often when something doesn't work that we discover something far more valuable than we would have if everything had gone smoothly. So when you fail, and you will, because all human beings do, don't see it as evidence that you are broken. See it as a threshold. Something sacred has been revealed. It's not there to punish you. It's there to wake you up, to draw your attention to what matters, to remind you that the goal is not to avoid falling, but to stand up each time with a deeper grasp of the truth. Because it is in those very moments, stripped of illusion, confronted by reality, that we become most human and most capable of becoming who we are meant to be. Resilience is not a trait you are born with. It is not an innate gift, nor is it merely a mindset that you can acquire through affirmation or wishful thinking. Resilience is forged. It is shaped through the furnace of adversity, not once but many times, and it is sustained only through your willingness to confront and integrate the experiences of failure, pain, and course correction. That's a difficult truth, but one that holds enormous power because it puts the means of growth squarely in your hands, though it comes at a cost. And that cost is the willingness to endure suffering in the service of becoming someone who can withstand it. When people speak about resilience, they often imagine strength. But strength does not come first. Before strength, there is usually loss. The loss of a plan, of a goal, of a sense of certainty, or even of identity. And that loss is destabilizing. It reveals that you were wrong about something, or that the world did not cooperate with your expectations, or that your skills were insufficient for the challenge at hand. In that moment, you are confronted with pain and disorientation. It feels like collapse. But collapse is not the end. It is a demand for reconstruction. And that reconstruction is where resilience is born. It is easy to be stable when things are going well, but stability under ease is not resilience. It is only when the ground falls out from under you, when your efforts fail, your relationships fracture, your body or mind breaks down, that the real test appears. The question is not whether you can avoid these moments. You can't. The question is whether you can absorb them, learn from them, and emerge from them not untouched, but transformed. That's the true nature of resilience, not bouncing back as if nothing happened, but coming back differently, wiser, stronger, more precise, more oriented toward reality. And here's where correction becomes vital, because loss alone doesn't create resilience. You can be broken by loss, just as easily as you can be made by it. The difference is in how you respond. The resilient person doesn't just survive the loss. They reflect on it. They examine their role in it. They ask, what did I miss? What can I learn? What do I need to change? This is the process of correction, not in the punitive sense, but in the developmental sense. Correction means course adjustment. It's humility in action. It's the willingness to admit that the path you were on was flawed and to step onto a better one, even if it's unfamiliar or difficult. That process is not glamorous. It's often slow, painful, and deeply personal. It may involve grieving a former version of yourself. It may require changing long-held beliefs or habits. But each time you go through that cycle, loss, reflection, correction, you become more stable in the face of chaos. You gain confidence, not because you think you'll never fall again, but because you know you can recover. That knowledge is hard-earned. It can't be faked, and it becomes the foundation of a deeper, more grounded form of self-respect. In a culture that idolizes comfort and instant gratification, this message is often unwelcome. We're told we can bypass the pain and still gain the strength. But that's a lie. Resilience requires exposure. It requires confrontation with reality. And reality doesn't care about your comfort. It cares about your capacity to adapt. Every failure, every disappointment, every hard conversation or painful truth you face is an opportunity to build that capacity if you allow it to be. But if you avoid it, if you numb yourself or blame others or insist on staying the same, you rob yourself of that transformation. Resilience is not about becoming untouchable. It's about becoming capable of standing in the storm without losing your structure, capable of enduring the weight of life without collapsing into bitterness or despair. And that capacity is only built through trial, through the willingness to lose, to correct, and to rise again, not in denial of the loss, but because of what the loss taught you. That is the path toward real strength, and it is a path available to everyone who chooses to walk it. Avoiding failure may seem like a reasonable strategy, even a prudent one. After all, who willingly steps into situations that might bring humiliation, disappointment, or loss? But while the instinct to protect oneself from pain is natural, it becomes pathological when it governs our decisions. The attempt to avoid failure entirely is, paradoxically, a path that leads directly to suffering. Not the acute, character-shaping suffering of growth, but the dull, corrosive kind that breeds bitterness, stagnation, and regret. It is not failure that ruins people. It is the refusal to risk failure that slowly erodes their potential and poisons their view of the world. Many people don't try because they're afraid to lose. They fear being judged, making mistakes, looking foolish, or falling short. And so they construct a life where everything is calculated, where risks are minimized, challenges are sidestepped, and vulnerability is avoided. At first, this strategy feels safe. You avoid the pain of public failure. You sidestep embarrassment. You preserve your image. But beneath that surface of control, something essential begins to die. Your sense of growth, agency, and vitality. You may not be failing outwardly, but you're decaying inwardly. You stop evolving, and eventually that stillness becomes unbearable. Human beings are made to aim at something. To take aim is to stake a claim on the future, to declare a goal and move toward it. But any real goal, anything worth pursuing, comes with the risk of failure. You might not get the job. The relationship might end. The business might collapse. The dream might not materialize. That's true. But avoiding the risk entirely ensures something far worse. You don't become the person who could have achieved it. And over time, that unspent potential turns against you. It becomes self-loathing. It becomes resentment. You start blaming the world for not giving you what you were too afraid to pursue. You become bitter. Bitterness is the consequence of a life unlived, and the roots of it are often hidden in 1,000 small decisions to play it safe. You avoid speaking your mind to keep the peace. You don't apply for that opportunity because you might be rejected. You don't commit. You don't leap. You don't stretch. And you justify it with rationalizations like, it's just not the right time, or I'm being realistic. But deep down, you know what's really happening. You're avoiding the possibility of failing, but in doing so, you're also avoiding the possibility of succeeding. More importantly, you're avoiding the necessary friction that forges character. It's important to understand that failure is not a verdict. It's a process. It's feedback. Every failure contains information about the limits of your current understanding, about your preparation, about your blind spots. But if you're unwilling to fail, you cut yourself off from that information. You remain ignorant. You freeze in place. You may preserve your ego in the short term, but you pay for it with long-term mediocrity. And mediocrity, for someone who knows they're capable of more, is a silent form of psychological torment. There's a deeper tragedy, too. When you avoid failure, you often become cynical toward those who embrace it. You mock their ambition. You downplay their struggles. Why? Because watching someone else risk and grow is a mirror to your own inaction. Their courage threatens your complacency. And rather than rise to the challenge, you retreat into bitterness. You begin to see the world as unfair, success as arbitrary, and effort as futile. This is the mindset of the defeated, not because they lost, but because they never truly entered the game. The antidote is clear but difficult. Step forward, accept the risk, understand that failure is not the enemy, avoidance is. Take action, not because you're guaranteed to win, but because you refuse to be frozen by fear. Only in motion do you learn. Only in effort do you grow. And only through facing the possibility of failure do you become someone capable of carrying the weight of success without collapsing under it. The goal is not to avoid falling, but to build a life that is worth the risk of falling for. That is how you avoid the real failure, the failure of never having truly lived. When we fail, our first instinct is often to internalize it as a personal flaw, a sign of weakness, incompetence, or inadequacy. And while failure certainly can reveal something about our own limitations, to stop there is to misunderstand its deeper function. Failure is not simply a mirror reflecting your flaws. It's a teacher revealing how the world actually works, how systems function, how patterns unfold, and how reality responds to action. When properly examined, failure maps the territory. It shows you the rules you didn't know you were playing under. It teaches you the structure of the external world, not just the contents of your internal one. We often go into challenges with assumptions. Assumptions about how long things will take, how people will respond, how hard a task will be, how equipped we are. These assumptions are often inherited unconsciously from our upbringing, culture, or ideals. But assumptions are not knowledge. They are guesses we've mistaken for certainty, and reality does not bend to your guesses. When you act based on flawed assumptions, you are likely to be met with resistance, breakdown, or outright collapse. That's failure. But that failure isn't just telling you something about you. It's telling you that the world is more complex, more nuanced, and more demanding than you believed. For example, imagine launching a new project or starting a business. You might assume that your passion and talent will carry you to success, but you discover that passion alone isn't enough. You must understand logistics, marketing, negotiation, finance. You must understand human behavior, including your own. And when you fail in those areas, it doesn't simply mean you are not good enough. It means there are principles in operation that you were unaware of. Reality is governed by structures, social, economic, biological, even moral. And when you push against those structures without understanding them, you get resistance. That resistance, painful though it may be, is instructive. This is a vital shift in perspective. When you begin to see failure not as personal condemnation but as environmental feedback, you start learning in a fundamentally different way. You stop asking, "What's wrong with me?" and start asking, "What's wrong with my model of the world?" That is a profound and mature question. It invites growth, not just in self-esteem, but in competence. You begin to upgrade your maps. You start to see that the world contains patterns, that success is not random, and failure is not punishment. It is information. And the wise person mines that information for truth, even when it's painful. Moreover, failure doesn't just teach you about external reality, it teaches you how your internal world misinterprets that reality. It reveals your cognitive biases, your wishful thinking, your illusions of control. It shows you where your pride outpaces your preparation, or where your fear is masking itself as practicality. You begin to see that the mind is not naturally calibrated to truth. It must be disciplined into truth, and failure is one of its most effective instructors. That's why some of the wisest people you'll ever meet are also the ones who've failed the most. Not because they were weak, but because they learned how to listen. Of course, this kind of learning demands humility. It requires you to set aside ego and admit that your previous model of the world and of yourself was insufficient. That is a painful admission, but it's also liberating. Because if the problem is your model, then you can build a better one. You're not doomed to repeat the same mistakes, provided you've really learned what they were pointing to. You begin to align yourself not with your desires, but with reality itself. And that alignment is what produces both success and integrity. In the end, failure is one of the few experiences that reliably reveals how the world actually works. It's a stripping away of illusion. It hurts, yes, but it's sacred pain, the kind that wakes you up, the kind that demands your attention. And if you answer its call with courage, you don't just grow more capable, you grow more attuned to truth. And truth, whether about yourself or the world, is the only real foundation upon which a meaningful life can be built. Growth, whether personal, professional, or intellectual, does not happen in a vacuum. It requires feedback, information, about how your actions, thoughts, or behaviors align with reality and desired outcomes. But not all feedback is equal. The kind that truly propels growth is hierarchical in nature, meaning it comes from sources or systems that are more competent, more experienced, or better calibrated to reality than you are at your current stage. Without this form of structured feedback, you remain trapped in your own perspective, blind to your blind spots, and unable to correct your course effectively. Failure, then, is one of the most honest and powerful forms of hierarchical feedback available. It is the system's way of telling you, you missed the mark. Adjust. This concept might be unfamiliar because modern culture often promotes the idea that you can just will your way to success, or that positive thinking alone is enough. But reality is more demanding. The world is a complex hierarchy of causes and effects, of skill levels and knowledge domains. Each level in this hierarchy builds upon the one below it. When you fail, you are confronted by feedback from a higher point in that hierarchy, whether that's the environment, other people, or the natural consequences of your actions. Failure is a signal that you have not yet mastered the challenges posed at your current level, and that you must either adapt or be left behind. The reason this feedback is hierarchical is because it inherently carries the wisdom of what's effective and what isn't. When you succeed, you might feel confident, but success alone doesn't necessarily reveal the flaws in your approach. You might be succeeding despite inefficiency or flawed thinking. But failure cuts through that illusion. It exposes where your understanding or behavior falls short relative to the demands of reality. The lesson embedded in failure is not just, "You were wrong," but, "This is the level of competence required and you have not reached it yet." That makes failure invaluable, because it provides you with a benchmark against which to measure your growth. Without such hierarchical feedback, growth stagnates. You may move forward, but only blindly without a compass or map. You might feel busy or productive, but you are not necessarily getting better. Worse, you may be cultivating illusions of competence, fooling yourself into believing you're progressing when you're not. That is the danger of avoiding failure or dismissing its importance. It's not just that you miss the lesson. You miss the entire framework by which true improvement is measured. Growth requires the humility to listen to these signals, even when they challenge your self-image or comfort. Another critical point is that failure provides feedback not only about external reality, but also about your internal processes, your habits, attitudes, and assumptions. It reveals the parts of your character or cognition that need development. Perhaps you rushed a task because of impatience. Maybe you failed to prepare because of overconfidence. Maybe your communication was unclear due to underlying fear. Failure draws your attention to these subtleties because it is a natural consequence of how your internal state interacts with the external world. In this way, failure acts like a mirror held up to your deepest processes, forcing you to confront and refine them. In order to truly benefit from hierarchical feedback, you must cultivate a mindset that views failure not as a defeat, but as a vital component of learning and growth. This means adopting an attitude of curiosity and openness rather than shame or defensiveness. It means engaging with failure analytically. What exactly went wrong? What can I do differently next time? Which skills or knowledge do I need to develop? This kind of engagement transforms failure from a negative endpoint into a dynamic process, a stepping stone that leads upward. It also means understanding that hierarchical feedback often comes from sources that challenge your ego and pride, teachers, mentors, critics, or harsh realities. The temptation is to reject this feedback because it is uncomfortable or inconvenient, but rejecting it is rejecting growth. Embracing it requires courage and humility, qualities that are cultivated precisely through the repeated experience of failure and correction. Ultimately, you cannot grow without hierarchical feedback, because growth is about aligning yourself ever more closely with reality and competence. Failure is one of the most potent forms of this feedback because it reveals the gap between where you are and where you need to be. It demands your attention, forces reassessment, and creates the conditions for genuine improvement. To avoid failure is to close yourself off from this essential information, to stagnate in place, and to live beneath your potential. Growth, therefore, depends on learning to listen deeply to failure, to understand it as an invaluable guide on the path toward becoming your best self. The way we perceive failure fundamentally shapes the course of our lives. It influences not only how we respond to setbacks, but also whether we pursue meaningful goals at all. To live meaningfully, to commit oneself to a worthwhile aim that transcends fleeting pleasure or convenience, requires a profound reframing of failure. Failure cannot be seen as an endpoint or as a verdict of personal inadequacy. Instead, it must be understood as a vital and necessary component of the pursuit of meaning, a signal that challenges us to grow, to adjust, and to deepen our engagement with reality. Meaningful existence is not about comfort or ease. It is about voluntarily shouldering responsibility for something greater than yourself, whether that is a creative project, a relationship, a body of knowledge, or a community. This act of commitment inevitably involves risk of loss, risk of error, risk of failure. The modern tendency to avoid discomfort or to seek immediate success obscures this truth, leaving many trapped in a shallow version of life that is defined by safety rather than significance. Without a willingness to fail, there can be no deep exploration of purpose, no real testing of the boundaries of your potential. Reframing failure means shifting your focus from the fear of making mistakes to an appreciation of failure as a form of dialogue with the world. Failure is not punishment, it is communication. It is the world's way of telling you that your current approach is flawed, incomplete, or insufficiently aligned with reality. When you accept this perspective, failure becomes less threatening and more enlightening. Instead of causing paralysis, failure motivates inquiry. It compels you to ask, what am I missing here? What assumptions am I making that need revision? How can I improve? This inquisitive stance turns failure into a source of growth rather than despair. This reframing also acknowledges that failure has a profound ethical dimension. To pursue meaning means to aim at a horizon of values that are intrinsically challenging: truth, courage, honesty, competence. These values cannot be achieved without facing difficulties, and difficulties often manifest as failures. The rejection of failure is, therefore, a rejection of these values. Conversely, embracing failure signals your commitment to living according to them, even when it is costly or uncomfortable. This is what it means to live authentically and purposefully, to be willing to pay the price required by the life you choose. Moreover, reframing failure is essential because it liberates you from the tyranny of perfectionism and the paralysis of fear. When failure is seen as a natural part of growth rather than as evidence of worthlessness, the motivation shifts from avoiding mistakes to seeking improvement. This mindset reduces anxiety and self-condemnation, replacing them with resilience and curiosity. It allows you to experiment, to take risks, to innovate. Without this shift, fear of failure can become so overwhelming that you cease to take meaningful action, resigning yourself instead to mediocrity or stagnation. This reframing also has a social and relational component. People who fear failure often withdraw from relationships or opportunities for collaboration, afraid of rejection or judgment. But when failure is reframed as part of the shared human experience of striving and learning, it fosters empathy and connection. It reminds us that everyone encounters setbacks and that vulnerability is a bridge rather than a barrier. By adopting this perspective, you not only deepen your own capacity for meaning, but also enhance your ability to engage authentically with others. In the grander scheme, the reframing of failure helps integrate the painful realities of life into a coherent narrative. Life is not a linear progression of successes, but a complex journey marked by trials, errors, and recoveries. When you can place failure within this broader narrative, not as a detour or a dead end, but as an integral step, your sense of meaning strengthens. You understand that setbacks are not contradictions of your purpose, but expressions of its difficulty and worth. Ultimately, the reframing of failure is not just a psychological trick. It is a fundamental shift in worldview that underpins a meaningful existence. It transforms failure from an enemy to a guide, from a source of shame to a source of wisdom. It requires courage and humility, but promises a richer, more authentic life in return. To live meaningfully is to embrace failure as a teacher, to listen to its lessons, and to move forward with greater clarity and resolve. Without this reframing, the pursuit of meaning remains elusive, and life risks devolving into a series of missed opportunities and unfulfilled potential.